You are listening to MSP 1337, a podcast dedicated to helping MSPs and their clients navigate cybersecurity. Security maturity is a journey, but that doesn't mean you have to travel alone. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and I want to personally thank you for joining us today. Before we jump into the show, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, MSP-Ignite. MSP-Ignite offers a peer group experience that is unique to managed service providers in the technology industry. If you are serious about implementing a model for success through sharing and collaboration of best practices, this is the best way to do it. Head on over to msp-ignite.com today to find out more. Now on with the show. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of MSP 1337, where we have off-the-cuff conversations pertaining to all things security. And today I have Eric Hansen of Inlet Productivity on. Welcome, Eric.
Well, thanks, Chris.
Hey, we had an episode where we talked about pleasure. What we didn't elaborate on is that is direct quoted from Mr. Deeds. I have to say that was from a movie. That was not some sort of inside joke. So Eric, we've known each other since the inception of MSPs, I think early 2000s. And we've had some conversations recently that made both of us say, hey, let's do a podcast about that. So today, I think it'd be good to talk about the MSP, MSsP, and why that second S needs to be lowercase in the context of MSPs are still really important to the industry. So Eric, we were talking about everything that pertains to security services and MSPs needing to add sort of this additional product service model to what we've already probably been doing. We manage firewalls, we put endpoint protection on devices. And so things that keep coming up and we're all sort of gravitating towards them is that how do they integrate, right? How do we ingest all of this information to make better decisions that may or may not be decisions that should be made by our own technicians, but again, the information is being digested and what do we do with it? So I'd like to just kind of jump off there. Talk to me about your thoughts around integration and what does that mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it means different things to different people and different sizes of MSPs and MSPs that are trying to do different things. We have taken kind of the approach that while I want notifications, those sorts of things coming into our PSA, I don't necessarily want, the one-click integration to, I got this ticket, I'm going to work on this ticket, I click the link, and I'm connected to that client's workstation. I think some of those types of integrations are actually creating security problems for us or potential security problems for us down the road, as we've seen with, I know that his name is escaping me, but the MSP that was breached up in Central
Brian
California.
Weiss.
Yeah. So, when his company was breached, I don't know the exact details of it, but, the more we integrate this thing and make it so that, okay, if I authenticated here, I'm authenticated everywhere to every part of our enterprise. I think in their case, it was the
RMM.
The RMM was compromised, and then the RMM was used to distribute the payload. But, we all have PSAs that are facing the internet too, because that makes it easy for the technician who, especially in this environment, is working from home. And maybe that PSA is doesn't even require you to VPN into your location or the vendor if it's hosted. There's no requirement to do that. We've got multi-factor authentication, but as we've seen, in the last couple of days, with all the stuff going on with SolarWinds,
sure,
that there's a way around that, and there have been demonstrated ways around that multi-factor authentication too. So I think having, maybe our approach is overly paranoid.
So
this business is so different that way.
Well, let's talk about let's talk about paranoia for a minute. I think about all the clients that I have who are using, say, Google as their single sign-on, right? So I just did an assessment of a company that one of the employees had 54 third-party cloud apps that they were using their Google credentials for to sign on to the other service, of which only 4 were even verified by Google. So what you're talking about when we think about integration is knowing what vendors' products and what they're allowing. When we start saying, let's do an API integration, and depending on the level of integration, how much information is actually flowing back and forth, not even counting when we get into credentialed authentication, just the information as a whole. Like, what does it matter? Is it important enough to have the integration? Because I think what I'm hearing you say is, as an MSP, it's less about this bi-directional user experience, because one can say, I don't care if you have to put the thing in by hand, one character at a time. I would rather be more secure than more efficient on some of this stuff. But the reality is we have to ingest the information for our guys to make good decisions. And the last thing we want is for them to bounce between dashboards or panes of glass, if you will, to make informed decisions about where they do need to go and dive in.
Right. Right. So, I mean, it really is. It's really a double-edged sword, I think, and that ability to pass that information between systems is.
We're also not being asked, right? We're not being asked like, hey, Eric, what would you like to have integrated? You're just being told there's now an integration.
Right. I have this swell thing here.
Right.
Do this API and boom.
Look what we did. Yeah. Look what we did for you. And you're going, and how does this help me? Because I think that's an area that I've really struggled with. Is we see a lot of really cool things, and I'm known for the shiny object syndrome of, ooh, I like that. And
you always have.
Right.
For as long as I've known you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and we haven't even talked about what it does for me yet. I've just said, I gotta have this. It's like buying a car, and I didn't need a car because I have a car, but I like that one. And I wasn't planning on buying it to drive it. I wasn't planning on buying it to ever use it for anything. I just want it because it gets better gas mileage than the one I have. So we were kind of going through this like MSP, MSSP model and the lowercase s, because we are at this point realizing that every MSP is now in some way, shape, or form participating in a security services model. And so one of the things that has been challenging for me as I talk to other MSPs is they're like, well, I'm debating whether or not to come the MSSP with 2 capital S's. And I get where they're coming from, because the culture that we're in right now is driving us towards, you need to do more security, therefore you just by default become this new entity. And so having known you since, 2005, 2006, as the MSP that the company that I was at used, I believe that while you've had to evolve on services and delivery models, by and large, you haven't changed the model of being an MSP.
Probably not. Probably not. The model of being an MSP is what we do. I think we've always been, at least, tried to be a little more forward thinking about on the security side than maybe some other MSPs, because the focus as an MSP is just make the thing work. My kind of my mantra to new engineers is, look, the customer doesn't care that you won. The customer cares that it works.
Right.
And we've always kind of taken, while you have to take that approach that, look, I don't care that you spent 9 hours figuring out why the hell that workstation was doing that weird thing. When in an hour you could have laid an image down and put the person back to work. That's the result the customer wants. The customer doesn't want to know that, okay, you super engineer fixed it. But
and wouldn't that to some extent be, so if I was the security guy for an MSSP and I get called in, my job isn't about fixing the computer and giving the user experience back. My job is finding out what did it, how it did it, so it doesn't ever do it again. And I think that's where there's a conflict.
Yeah.
Therein
Yeah.
lies
What
the
thing was
conflict.
wrong? Yeah. What thing was wrong that allowed this to happen? And how do we fix that moving forward? Or really, I think what an MS little sp ought to be doing is making sure that all those pieces are in place that prevent it from happening in the
Sure.
first place.
So if you can be preventative, you don't necessarily have to become the two big S's, right? Like this is,
Right.
I don't necessarily need a security operations center if I've got my security services stack dialed in such a way that, for lack of a better word, we're going into that sort of zero trust model that says we're not saying yes to install all apps that you want. We're saying this is the approved list of apps, and no, you are not installing them yourself.
Right. Right. And if, I mean, there are certainly valid business reasons that you have to make exceptions to those lists.
But you
And
just said it. It's an exception to the
right.
list.
Right. It's an exception to the list, not a, we try not to be back in the days where everyone's a local administrator on their workstation.
Right. Well,
But
that's a phishing campaign being successful, right? If the exception is the one user that clicks on it is an admin, that's a relatively big problem. But by and large, that's a big exception to have the one person who already is the exception would be the one that clicked on it, right? Like you're gambling on a much better odds for it not happening.
well, yes, but no, because you have the, in the clientele that we work with, you have a lot of owners that, because, we're talking about small, medium business typically. You have a lot of owners who are like, well, I need to have administrative credentials in case we decide we're going to fire you, or you get hit by a bus, or whatever it is. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's totally fair. You should have that, but you cannot be logging in with that. That can't be your default account, because, I need you to be able to, yes, you need to be able to pull the ripcord and get into that system,
but you also
don't
need indemnification. Both of us do. Right.
Yeah. And I mean, we've seen instances of, I've been doing this for so long. We've seen instances of just about everything. Literally today, we had a customer that refuses to do multi-factor authentication. And I note I said customer, not client, because they don't take all of our services. That refuses to do multi-factor authentication. So as I'm sitting here chatting with you, I'm watching this Teams feed from my guys. Yep, this client got an account compromised again. And then the guy who, if we would allow it, he actually would have had 365 administrative privileges. He went in and put his username and password in on that. So now we got 2 compromised accounts. All in the span of like 15 minutes. Oh, by the way, is now a good time for me to point out, they had the same issue literally last week. We're back here. So, and they still won't turn on MFA.
And what's
too hard.
What's the resistance to too? Oh, well, you said too hard. I mean, what's the definition of too hard? I mean, literally, we're talking about like maybe putting in 6-digit code or hitting a button that says allow.
Right. Well, we have one user that has a flip phone. We don't think he'll be able to figure it out.
Well, I have heard,
buy him a smartphone.
Well, or not.
Or get a YubiKey. Or
I was going to say, there you go.
Or
I mean, we're saying that this is about phones and not 2-factor authentication. I mean, we could probably spend a whole episode just talking about how we've evolved in this quote smartphone space, and we've forgotten that the technology for 2FA has nothing to do with having a more sophisticated phone.
Right.
I mean, that's convenient per se. I mean, shoot, if you can buy a YubiKey that can actually plug into your smartphone, well, then I would argue that 2FA is much larger than phones.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, that's the perception people have. So I don't want to type in a code. I don't want to do this. I don't want to pay my taxes either, but I do.
Sure. I think about, so back in the day, I was used the PayPal, the VeriSign key, right? The RSA
Mhm.
little thing around on a keychain. So I got mine probably in 2007. I think it was literally in the last year, the battery finally died. Like,
Yeah.
so when we talk about, sort of like technology to support 2FA, it in and of itself is almost a dinosaur.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, we had a client that would back when monitors had big wide edges, they would actually take the RSA key and double sticky tape it onto the monitor.
Oh yeah.
Like, I'm not really sure that's a good idea.
I mean, to some extent, that's like just putting a lot of Post-it notes in sequence for the next rollover for the next six-digit code, right?
That's where the passwords were. Those were on the Post-it notes.
Right. I think that is a really not to digress down the rabbit hole, but if our conversation is getting into the weeds on a security token for 2FA or multi-factor authentication, how badly do you want that customer? And we, like you said, customer versus client, they're not taking all your services. I think every MSP has to ask the question, when a client or customer is absolutely refusing on the more minutia of security, like, do you really want this burden to be in your portfolio?
Right. Well, and you have to make that decision. And while there are certainly MSPs who are like, you shall do it my way or the highway, and that's it. The reality is, for most MSPs, that's not how we work. You have this legacy base of clients that you had that were customers.
They've been with since the beginning.
Right. They've been with you forever. And in this case, this is one of those for us.
Sure.
And they haven't had a big enough security event to make it, oh crap, we need to do this.
Well, and you're describing a problem that, until it really is bad, is it big? It's not. I mean, you're fixing it for them, so what's the big deal?
Well, it depends how long it takes to fix. So we had a client that who it is, but we obviously I'm not going to talk about that. Had got phished and got compromised, and thank God they found it before it had gotten the entire network, but it had gotten a big chunk of it. And
alphabetically, of course.
Oh yes, alphabetically. Fortunately, they were working on a project that was early in the alphabet, so they found it.
I believe it started with a B.
But and they happened to be working late that day. But it was, they had moved to a model of, okay, well, we're going to be break fix, and whatever you have to come and fix, that's fine. And they had that event, and they actually got it. And, because I've seen customers that have these security events, and they're like, oh, what's the chances of that happening again? Better than you think. But these guys got it, and now if we go to them, you need to do this, they do it. And when go ahead. Oh, I was going to say, and when we take on a conversation with a new potential client for us is very different.
Sure.
Than an existing relationship. We go in and we're like, look, yeah, here's the part you want to do, and here's the part I'm telling you have to do.
Right.
Or we're not doing this because there's too much risk for me. We had one of these. We had one recently, and I think we lost the deal. We had been their IT provider for a number of years through a big system integration, and there was a falling out inside the organization between a manager who happened to be a family member and the owner who was the other family member. So we ended up being, a few months later, we were the collateral damage. So we end up working for the other family member who goes and starts the exact same kind of business.
Sure.
Doing exactly the same thing. And, finally the family reconciles. I think it's been about 6 years. Well, in that 6 years, they've had 4 IT providers.
You're talking about the other side of the divorce.
The other side of the divorce, right?
Gotcha.
So they've had 4 IT providers. They haven't been happy with any of them. And we went in there, and I went in for this meeting expecting, okay, there's going to have to have been a fair number of things that have changed. I mean, this infrastructure's 9 years old at this point. It was like walking into the same room, nothing had changed with the exception of the firewall. That is the only part of the entire infrastructure that had changed. Still had the same 10-year-old ruckus stuff.
Sure.
So, okay, I see. Okay, you haven't really grown. All right, kind of know what we have here. Let me go back and we'll do the investigation from our side. I put their IP address in Shodan. The thing's got an open RDP server.
Wow.
To the internet. I mean, literally, I called them. I'm like, I can't believe you haven't been hacked yet.
So what's
because that administrator password hasn't changed in 5 service providers.
Yeah, like so it's you brought up something that I think is really important to note, and that is there's nothing wrong with a break fix model, right? There's nothing wrong with an MSP model that's however the structure works for you. But what's really interesting is when you start talking about security services that are subscription based, that are not tied to T&M, especially when there's sort of like this visualization that the client suddenly has, this epiphany that says, I understand what you're saying to me and what it stops. They will sign a lot of contracts for those types of services, but they're a lot tighter with the wallet when it's about, am I buying a Lenovo or HP laptop? One's $500, one's $1,500. Now we're in a different world of conversation, and they're very quick to say, well, this is just a machine, and all the hours that you're putting into it is a completely different conversation than you want to layer security services and you want to charge me a flat fee for it, because they've either gone through the breach and experienced paying you T&M to bring them back to life, or they're just realizing that what's happening around them, that this just makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and the unfortunate thing is I don't think that they really realize it around themselves until they've been through it. And some people need to go through it, in a really, really bad way.
Unfortunately, I'd say it's probably more like 75% or more needs some level of bad thing, whether it's you lost $20 and that was a lot of money to them, or it's they lost their first, I mean, it could be anything, right? Like you put the measure of value on it, whatever you want it to be might not be enough, but then whatever is, priceless to them, just like the shark in the picture behind you, whether it's real or not, to somebody that's really important.
Right. Yeah. So we've gotten pretty far afield to where we started here, though.
I think we're in the same spot. We've just continued to tell stories that are articulating, I think, the need for an MSP to at least embrace the second little s.
The small s, yeah.
Small s. And recognize that they don't have to be 2 big S's, because ultimately that gets into where you would either partner with, or you're really having that conversation with yourself or somebody else in your company to say, do we want to become something that we never started out to be?
Yeah.
That's what I've heard throughout every story we've talked about, has been about how you've had to apply that little s to manage services. And I think that that's really important for every MSP out there to hear, is that the goals with your business aren't necessarily to become a security company. In fact, I would hope not, because if we don't have enough MSPs and all we have is security companies, then there won't be a whole lot of businesses.
Yeah.
Our walls will be no doors and no windows.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's, there's obviously some degree of risk that these companies have to assume, to do whatever it is they do.
Well, isn't that the conversation? I think about it. If you were my client as an MSP and I was talking to you about security, the first thing I would ask you is what security, plans, product, services have you executed internally in your own company? And obviously I know, having worked with you, that 2FA is one that's pretty high on your list. And if it doesn't support 2FA, it's probably not in your portfolio if there's something else that supports it.
Right.
So, so along those same lines, as we're wrapping this up, with security being of utmost importance, what's one thing that you would share with the audience at large, that if you were to impart wisdom on other MSPs as it pertains to little s or 2 big S's, either one, what would it be?
Well, I think little s means going back and looking at those basic things that are the big roadblocks, using reasonable password policy. Okay, everybody's doing that. But you'd be stunned at how frequently I see networks still today that there's no user account lockout, or you've got RDP open to the outside world. I mean, if you've got user account lockout and you're synchronizing your AD to Microsoft, you now have that policy applied on the 365 accounts automatically.
Right.
And going back and looking at, now we have the security framework from 365 that you didn't have 2 years ago. Well,
Sure.
that person that you deployed 365 3 years ago on, they don't have that because it didn't become automatically turned on. You have to go back and take those steps to do it. But I think, I think companies put themselves at great risk, meaning MSPs, with your customers believing that you're at least an little SP.
Sure.
And that you're going back and checking those boxes. But how many MSPs really are going back and checking those boxes? And
well, it's not free.
It's not free. It takes time.
Right. It takes time.
You probably have engineer bandwidth right now, given the environment that we're in. You're trying to keep all your people on, unless you went through and just ruthlessly cut to the bone, trying to make those MSP metrics that we're all told,
Sure.
You need to be at this utilization percentage, and
yep.
you need to look like this. Unless you did that, to try and keep those numbers where you're told by the industry experts they're supposed to be, you probably have the bandwidth to go back and do this. And at the end of the day, if you get compromised, or if your customer gets compromised and that word gets out,
your reputation,
your reputation is way more important than, the extra 2 hours you paid an engineer to go back and make this.
Sure.
Right.
Well, I'll just throw this out there. It seems like, and I would suspect that even if you didn't cut anything or you cut a lot, every engineer that's client facing 24/7 probably has somewhere between 15 and 20% of their day that is not billable because they've got things that they got to do, from filling out timesheets to you name it. And the reality is, if your guys are growing on skill sets, which hopefully they all are, it's an easy exercise to say, hey, you've got A through J. I want you to go check 365. Is ATP, they bought it? Is it turned on? I mean, just the little things that
did somebody remember to turn that on and actually
right.
connect it to the account?
Or just thinking about like, hey, we have firewalls with all of our clients. Hey, why don't today's Tuesday, let's double check and make sure that the logs are turned on for the firewalls. I mean, sounds very small and little s-ish, if you will. But the reality is, if you had to do forensics, it goes a long ways to at least have saying the firewall log was turned on, because you can't do much if the firewall log was off. It won't tell you anything. So, all right. Well, yeah. I just want to say that I really appreciate you being on this episode of MSP 1337. For those of you listening, look forward to next week when I'll have Eric on again with a special guest. And with that, thanks for joining us.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
You bet.